Scholar Lecture number 14. Today we have here our special guest, our visiting researcher all the way from Lund University, Sweden, Associate Professor Dr. SAMI AL-DAGHISTANI. And our moderator here is Dr. Khalina Khalili, our postdoctoral fellow from Istac-Iium. And today we will be our discussion and topic of presentation will be on economics, environment, and sustainability, a critical epistemology. So I would like to thank everyone who is online and here physically at IKCR room here. And we thank our Deputy Dean, Academic and Internationalization, Dr. Sharifa Fatima Az-Zahra Said Hussein, representing our Dean, Professor Dr. Hazizan Muhammad Noon, who has some events at Komba to participate, and thus she is replacing our Dean. And without further ado, we give her the floor to her to give a couple of talks here, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Our distinguished guests, professors, students, and also guests. Thank you so much, Dr. Nurul Ain, for organizing today's lecture series. I hear it's number 14 of the Istac Distinguished Lecture Series. Dr. Halina, our moderator. Thank you so much. First of all, let me convey the salam of the Dean and also his warm regards and sincerest apologies. Professor Dr. Hazizan Matnoon actually is regrettably unable to join because he has a meeting to attend in our Gombak campus. He has asked me to extend his heartfelt welcome to Dr. Sami and to express his deep appreciation for your presence here at Istac and your contribution to our academic community. And I hope there will be a chance for you to meet our Dean. So Dr. Sami, your presence here is really a testament to our shared commitment and collaboration, inshallah, for cross-cultural inquiry and conversations and also discourse and dialogue. We are really interested in the work that you do on economics, environment and sustainability, and also your work on happiness and the Islamic approach, looking at the epistemological lens. So that's something that we hope you might put in a little bit as well in your lecture today. So at Istac, we're dedicated to reviving and reimagining the intellectual traditions of the Muslim world in ways that engage us to think about contemporary challenges as well. So as we think about thoughts of the past and the legacy and also the intellectual treasures that are left behind, how can we think about the future and the present in terms of finding ways to improve the situation around us and also to fulfilling our responsibility. So as Prof. Hassan has emphasized, Istac stands for the integration of ethical wisdom with pressing current global issues. And so we believe that your lecture on economics, environment, and sustainability, a critical epistemology, aligns wonderfully with this ethos. So we are looking forward to hearing to you, and I would not like to take so much time. So thank you all for coming. I hope we have a vibrant session today, and there will be a lot of enriching interaction. So I will pass it back over to you, Dr. Nurul Ain.
Thank you, Dr. Sharifa. And today I would like to present a little bit on Dr. Khalina Muhammad Khalili. She earned her postgrad credentials in Islamic philosophy and civilization from UTM and holds a BA in economics from Columbia University and master in education from University of New England, USA. And now she will be the moderator and present our speaker today.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Thank you, Dr. Nur Ain, for that introduction, and welcome all. May Allah give you a blessed Friday today for your attendance for Seeking Knowledge. Without wasting any more time, I'd like to jump to introduce our distinguished scholar for today's lecture, and Dr. Sami Al-Daghistani. He will be presenting on the topic of on economics, environment and sustainability, a critical epistemology. I would first like to introduce his background. He is Associate Senior Lecturer at LUND University, Associate Faculty Member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, New York, and also Research Scholar at Columbia University's Middle East Institute. His interdisciplinary research explores Islamic economics, environmental ethics, and law, bridging historical Islamic intellectual traditions with contemporary issues. He previously held fellowships at institutions in Oslo and Columbia University and earned his PhD from Leiden University, co-supervised by Wael Halak. Dr. Sami has studied in universities in Sarajevo, Cairo, Rabat, Leiden, and McGill in Canada. He is the author of The Making of Islamic Economic Thought in 2022 and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's Ethical Teachings in 2021, among other works. He also leads the Critical Islamic Studies Consortium, promoting collaborative cross-cultural scholarship. Without any further ado, I welcome Dr. Sami al-Daghistani.
Thank you. Right on time. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Dear Dr. Khalina, Dr. Ain, Dr. Sharifa as well, dear professors, colleagues and friends. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for having me for this kind invitation and hospitality. It's a true pleasure being back at Istac and also in Kuala Lumpur, and I'm looking forward to a very friendly exchange of ideas during my stay here. Before I start, I would simply and very briefly like to take this opportunity, which I think is a privileged role that we as academics play, to say that I stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and oppressed people everywhere. As you might know, today is the 30th anniversary as well of the genocide in Srebrenica, which happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And unfortunately, we're continuing seeing the atrocities being committed across the world, but especially in the Middle East. And I think it's our task as scholars and as researchers to continue pointing out to these ongoing atrocities in the world. So I'm pleased to spend the next 45 minutes or so with you and to present on a topic that it's not only dear to my heart, but I think also very important when it comes to advancing ideas on environmental and economic teaching or thought in Islamic traditions and Middle East more broadly. And my examples or presentation rather will span both classical sources, but also some of the contemporary case studies. During the first part of the lecture, we'll look very briefly at economic science and also a few examples of economic teachings in Islamic tradition. In the second part, I will briefly present on economic thought. Finally, I will conclude with the notion of decoloniality. And a brief side note before we kick off, I advanced these very, I would say, different environmental and economic ideas from the perspective of intellectual history and ethics, right? I'm not trained as an economist. I come from humanities, so to speak, and Islamic studies in particular. Economics is, in any society, really about people's ways of acquiring a livelihood, but also about the behaviors and activities related to their livelihood. But I argue that both economics and environmental studies or environmental humanities are rather recent developments. However, environmental studies carry some of the same similar issues of knowledge production as does modern economic science. And I argue that modern economics and environment are based on the idea of progress and sustainability, respectively. They're primarily mechanistic and devoid of ethical fiber that respects a different nature of environmental or economic ideas found in other non-European traditions, in our case, obviously, in the Islamic intellectual traditions. These modern manifestations and methods are part of larger social, but also socio-political visions that measure the idea of economic progress on one hand, sustainable development on the other hand, not necessarily between the developed North and the developing South, which has always been sort of in place, but rather between those theories that are rooted in scientific reasoning, and on the other hand, the other theories that are rather frivolously regarded as unscientific simply because they're based in an ethical or metaphysical framework. In other words, despite the formal decolonization of many Muslim majority countries, policies of this notion of economic progress or sustainable development can be found in various refreshed forms in Muslim majority societies. And this is what Ernesto Valero Thomas calls sustainable Orientalism. So contemporary dominant discourses, methods, representations, which shape the very idea of sustainable development in cities, but also regions around the world to growing economies of non-Western societies. Also, very importantly, since economics and ecology are conceptually integrated terms, and this goes not only for Islamic intellectual tradition, but also for many other pre-modern traditions, including in ancient Greece, for instance, where oikos referred to family and a household, from both of which economics and ecology derive, right? I propose to study them as interconnected entities. For Aristotle, for instance, the individual human action of using wealth is what constitutes the so-called economic dimension. The purpose of economic action for Aristotle is to use things that are necessary for life, meaning survival, but also for that which is regarded as the so-called the good life or the flourishing, eudaimonia. And the good life, Aristotle informs us, is the moral life of virtue through which human being attains happiness. In early modern Europe, however, political economy was initially a branch of moral philosophy. Terms and concepts borrowed from physics, equilibrium, expansion, inflation, distribution, stability, and so on and so forth, emerged. They indicated a new discipline. One of the main concepts is also individual utility, which we all know too well, which was modeled according to the idea of energy in physics. So despite the many facets, if you will, of economic sub-theories, the main or orthodox or mainstream economics is rooted in liberal philosophy, neoclassical tradition, advocating for individual gains, free markets, rational choice theory. Mainstream economics then is the body of knowledge that is taught by universities worldwide and are generally also accepted by economists around the globe. Pre-modern sources might present a challenge of how we negotiate these sources from different time, different epistemological framework with contemporary financial or ecological concerns. This is undisputably true, but also I think it provides incentives of how to study economic and environmental ethics from the perspective of intellectual history or ethical psychology and more broadly metaphysics. And I think it provides new perspectives on how to conceptualize environment, economics, sustainability, and even nature itself. Now, very briefly, and this is simply due to the sort of lack of time, I will present a rundown of few major scholars on economic thought from the classical period, and I'll be happy to discuss more in detail about the scholars in the Q&A, but also I'll be happy to share the slides with you all. In my work, I often refer to the term economic cosmology. Now, the term economic cosmology has at least two interrelated yet distinct meanings. Firstly, cosmology indicates Sharia's ethical patterns in and of economic teachings or economic behavior, in that those patterns form human conduct in affairs, economic affairs, financial affairs, pertaining to also wider social metaphysical concerns. In other words, they connect to both ibadah, so matters of worship, but also commercial transaction or muamalat. The concept itself obviously did not exist in the classical milieu, but I argue that classical scholars were very much cognizant of Sharia's ethical patterns in and of economic behavior. Some scholars obviously believe that Muslim society developed a form of market economy in the early 7th century already, advocated for, let's say, accumulation of capital and so on and so forth. This would be Benedict Kohler, for instance. Other scholars claim that Muslim society never really developed an institution of corporation, Timur Quran, for instance, right, because of the restricting nature of Islamic law. There were also attempts by Western scholars to omit the contributions of Muslims on economic thought altogether. This has already been disputed by scholars such as Muhammad Ghazanfar, Abdullah Islahi, and others. So many of these theories are, in my assessment, partial in analyzing what exactly is economic thought in the pre-modern world, how it has been theorized, and what really Muslim contribution has been throughout the centuries, from 7th all the way to 15, even beyond to 18th century, right, through the colonial period. Unlike the contemporary counterparts, classical scholars did not separate between the disciplines, at least not in the same way as we moderns do, because economic thought was obviously part and parcel of broader ethical questions. So the economic teachings by, for instance, Al-Shaybani or Al-Muhasibi, Al-Isfahani, Al-Ghazali, and other scholars, they're all encompassing and in this sense cosmological, right? I think this is a more justified historical perspective, but it also brings more justice to the central themes of economic thought in Islamic intellectual tradition, right? They lived in various eras, they come from various backgrounds, which I think also testifies to the complexity and plurality of economic thought in Islamic history. Now, very briefly, if I go through, and here I selected 3 scholars just for the sake of this presentation. If we start very quickly with Al-Shaybani and his Kitab al-Kasb, the first, believed to be the first scholar who thought of, obviously, kasb, the very notion, the concept of kasb as acquisition of living or earning a livelihood, and zuhd, on the other hand, as renouncing the world, in his famous book. And he says that earning or kasb ought to be a service to public good, right? So whatever one earns has to be in service to public good. Now, public is obviously a very modern concept, but again, looking back in retrospect, we can say that this might mean a family, it might mean sort of relatives, it might mean the immediate community in which you live, and even beyond society at large. Ibadah relates obviously to mu'amalat, right? So sales, accumulation of wealth, values of money. They're treated within the context of piety, renunciation, and asceticism. Kasb for Al-Shaybani means then acquiring wealth by legal means and really corresponds to one's faith. And earning presupposes then cooperation between different industries and within a society. Next scholar on our list, and I will simply again, due to the time constraints, skip Al-Muhasibi and Al-Isfahani, but I'll be happy to take some questions if there are later on, is Al-Mawardi. Al-Mawardi, in his famous Adab al-Din wa Dunya, also talks about economic provision and piety, that they really go hand in hand, right? These also sort of provides or challenges rather our idea of what exactly is zuhd in the context of kasb, right? And what exactly Sufism is in the context of sort of active membership or active living in a society, if you will. Amal, business or trade, Al-Mawardi informs us, is part of human activities. And human activities relate to agriculture on one hand, but also production on the other hand. And Al-Mawardi, around the same time, obviously, as Al-Ghazali, he sets on to revive, quote unquote, revive the human being, right? It's Islah al-Insan. And this revival of human being is very much linked to financial means and economic means as well. Al-Madda al-Kafiya, right? So kasb, acquisition of wealth, he says, leads towards securing finances, but also human means more generally. Zuhd, on the other hand, means introspection, muhasaba, but also focuses on the notion of poverty, faqr, rather than riches, ghina. Finally, we come to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Again, I do not want to spend too much time on Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Last year when I came here, I gave a separate lecture on his sort of economic teachings. But in order to, again, it's a towering scholar that we cannot simply bypass. And in order to position his economic philosophy within his overall work, I think of Al-Ghazali as a scholar of heterogeneity, meaning that he really works at the intersection of various domains. They're typically understood as somewhat separate, right? As you well know, Al-Ghazali navigated Islamic jurisprudence and law, theology, philosophy, history, and finally tasawwuf or Sufi mystical tradition. His theoretical accounts of economic thought can be found in some of his major works, most notably Ihya Ulumuddin, obviously, somewhat less in Mizan al-Amal and Nasihat al-Muluk. These are very different works in terms of genre. So in other words, his work on economic thought is really spread out through various various bodies of knowledge. And I see Al-Ghazali developing this economic thought primarily in Ihya as part of his overall ethical epistemology, which is based on this idea of happiness or felicity or sa'ada, if you will. And this is very much connected to the science of the hereafter, as he calls it. It's a technical term, right? Ilm Tariq al-Akhirah, the science of the hereafter, which is embedded in this ethics of happiness. And again, relates to both theoretical knowledge, ilm, as we often translate, and amal, as informed practice or praxis, rather, in English. Few examples of what exactly Al-Ghazali means when he says developing economic thought within this ethical system. For instance, that money became a tool of exploitative practices in the caliphate already in the 12th century, right? So on the other hand, on one hand, you see scholars being dissatisfied with the political and the religious elite at the time in the 11th and 12th century. On the other hand, and this is obviously connected, you see proliferation of these types of work, which in my view, they critique, at least indirectly, the political establishment at the time, right? So he says money is a tool of exploitative practices. And wealth has obviously both religious, but also much more material benefits and harms. And it depends really on the usage of wealth. In other words, it depends on one's niyyah, intentions, right? And he says, no matter how much one earns, one wants to earn even more because of something called hubbul mal, so lust for money, right? So there is no upper limit. So what do you have to do then? Well, you have to balance them. You have to balance money, you have to balance wealth. And obviously, the more you earn or the wealthier you are, the more of a liability you are to the society as well, right? The more you have to sort of give back to society. Wealth then for Al-Ghazali means it's a means to achieve higher ends, right? It's a means to achieve higher ends, or it has to be treated as a medium of exchange. So like barter exchange, right? For certain goods, you can buy something with money, you can sell something as well, but it's never an end in and of itself, right? This is something that is sort of reverberated in other types of work throughout the intellectual history as well. And just one quote that I picked, for instance, in his Ihya in the 4th volume, Al-Ghazali says, quote, dirhams and dinars, so these are the silver coins and the golden coins, they're not created for any specific reason. They are without value in themselves and are like stones. Rather, they are created for circulation from person to person in order to promote transactions, meaning wealth has to be put back into circulation. It has to be spent, so to speak, right? It has to be put back in society. This brings me then to the notion on environment and nature more specifically. Knowledge production about and also representation of Arab peoples more specifically, but also Islam more generally, has always been used by colonial powers to legitimate their colonial projects and imperial goals. As you might know, Edward Said famously defines Orientalism as a system of representation of the other, non-Western culture or society, which is enclosed by a set of biases and prejudices. Taking, for instance, some of the green initiatives in the MENA region as a foundation to rethink the origins of modern knowledge on environment and economics, I think provides incentives to study the discourse of sustainability and ethics in the greater Middle East in a more nuanced way. So the MENA region is in the contemporary period frequently portrayed not as a natural habitat, but as a place of destruction, a place of conflict, right? And therefore very much aligned with environmental Orientalism and a construction of a natural habitat. For instance, this idea that nature is something that it's green, first and foremost, or nature is something that it really can be found in Europe or in the West and not in the MENA region, right? The existing scholarship then has often omitted theories that focus on a holistic understanding of the lived environment through the notion of human accountability. And you can find this concept of human accountability in obviously various contexts, maybe in the notion of tazkiyah, maybe in the notion of other ideas that can be found in the context of not only theology, but also philosophy and tasawwuf. And therefore, they maintain a particular hierarchy of knowledge, right, about environment, about nature. So this, in other words, brings into question these dominant environmental or economic imaginaries of how representation of nature has become a model and rather a norm for what we call nature itself. And I find these highly, highly problematic. Now, indulge me to read to you a rather lengthier quote from Timothy Mitchell. Now I can see it here. Is it possible to put it down a little bit because it's actually not such? So for some reason, it just obstructing. Is there a way to? Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it. So Mitchell says, quote, "The modern history of the Middle East has always been the history of a human relationship with nature. The environment appears to define the Arab Islamic world more than it does any other major region in world history. Stretched in an irregular shape from the Atlantic to Central Asia, the region of the Middle East and North Africa was always demarcated by its climate. Colonial histories, as Deanna Davis shows, could describe the pre-colonial order as incapable of managing this difficult human natural balance of maintaining regions' precarious ecology. Europeans could then justify their colonization of the Arab world in ecological terms." This brings me to the notion of Islamic environmentalism, or green Islam, if you will. And I think we have to perceive these terms and concepts also through a critical lens. Now, by reading several scholars on economic and environmental thought, both classical but also modern or contemporary, the two concepts, economics and environment, seem not only interdependent and closely intertwined, but also enmeshed in this idea of holistic accountability. For some scholars, Islamic environmentalism is an umbrella term that encompasses various fields, and this would include ethics, theology, Islamic law, water management and resources, nature conservation, but also mystical, philosophical, or even eco-philosophical thought, including Islamic economics and finance. Islamic environmentalism would emphasize the relevance of Islamic teachings for nature conservation and environmental protection in brief. However, like economics, also the concept of environment is clearly multifold. Nature, tabi'ah, is not completely disassociated from the celestial, nor is the economic from broader natural habitat. In the Quran, for instance, nature is often depicted as a visible manifestation of God. So the destruction of nature or economic development is seen as a human reappropriation of nature. And the more traditional theocentric view asserts that despite in the Quran God subjected, right, nature to man, it does not mean destruction of nature per se, but rather that human being can exercise sovereignty over nature in the context of Khalifa or vicegerency. Now, obviously, the key term here is sakhara, right? Alam taru anna Allaha sakhara lakum ma fi samawati wa fil ard. What exactly sakhara mean? Does it mean directly subjugation? Does it mean utility, to utilize something to your own benefit, and so on and so forth? This brings into question the very principle of autonomy of nature, in that it operates by its own laws. Rather, for these select scholars, nature's autonomy is encapsulated through cosmological processes. Human being, obviously, as a natural entity, is part of this creation. It participates in these natural processes and ecological balance. And any imbalance in the natural environment caused by human being is regarded as a destruction of the self, or dhulmun nafs. Obviously, there are various scholars that discuss the notion of Islamic environmentalism or green Islam. You have scholars such as Fazlun Khalid, who sees and criticizes rather global economic and financial systems, which are seen as the root cause for the ecological crisis. You have scholars such as Mawal Izzeddin's in his study of nature in the Quran. other scholars who could be regarded as belonging to the field of religion and ecology, but also the works, for instance, by Sayyid Hossein Nasr and his cosmological understanding of nature as sacred. And Nasr, for instance, claims, quote, that moderns attempt to view the natural environment as an ontologically independent order of reality means that it's divorced from the divine environment, right? So for Nasr, the traditional Islamic view of the natural habitat is based on this inextricably connected, permanent relation between what is today called the human and the natural environment, as well as the divine environment, which sustains or permeates them. Now, granted, some of these perspectives can be regarded as belonging to the Islamization of knowledge process, which posits a critique of modernity's predicaments, but also advocates for Islam's compatibility with modern knowledge. Often, however, such theories nurture a cyclic, self-perpetuating narrative of an alleged, quote-unquote, authentic Islamic economic or environmental philosophy by solely relying on the notion of tawhid to explain sort of human role in society, right? So, in other words, as if Islam offers a quick fix to structural problems that permeate Muslim majority societies, right? And this is somewhat problematic. To give you a few contemporary case studies, we'll discuss a few moments on the notion of the so-called green projects in the MENA region. Since the last decade, there has been a green shift taking place in the Middle East and North Africa, whereby various states have introduced more environmentally friendly approaches to tackle climate change. And I think that this moves really, comes as a major response to a modern environmental crisis, whereby contemporary MENA societies are trying to at least attempt to break from unsustainable patterns, despite being part of the global economical system, obviously. The Green Mosque Initiative in Morocco, for instance, in 2016, you had around 600 mosques that made the change to use renewable energy. And today you have over 6,000 mosques, whereby they're equipped with energy efficient tools. And the then Minister of Energy, Hakim Al-Hayte, said, quote, in 2011, Morocco integrated sustainable development in its constitution around 3 pillars: protection of the environment, economical policy, and considering climate change as a structural threat to Morocco. And the director of the National Agency for the Development, Saïd Moulin, says, quote, mosques are not a big consumer of electricity. There is some lighting, some water heating. What we want to do is to inform people. Energy efficiency is not only a matter of technology, it's also a matter of behavior, end of quote. So the country's mosques and their Islamic clerics are helping to make people recognize the benefits of saving energy. They want to, in other words, incentivize the population on this topic. And obviously, both imams, but also female clerics, they underwent training in energy efficiency. And the rationale behind this was that obviously religious clerics and circles, they have had high social standing in Morocco, right? Over 700 imams and officials from the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and 31% actually of whom are women, have adopted arguments in favor of the transition to clean energy. So this is all, wonderful. However, renewables provided only 19% of the national production in 2019. So in other words, coal, for instance, remains the main source of electricity with 65%. So a critical analysis of the main legislative or institutional reforms that really supports this development of renewables in Morocco raises the question of whether this has not mainly served as an excuse to further privatize the energy sector as well. The ruling elite has made private reduced rates of fossil fuels, and obviously this benefits first and foremost the international foreign companies, right? The French, the Saudi, the Spanish, the Emirati, the German, Siemens, and so on and so forth. Also, the Qatari government has been assessing its building policies so that every new mosque built in the country will be based on quote unquote environmentally friendly models, which would help save water and energy and so on and so forth. So you have other cases as well in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, and so on and so forth. In this context, the Green Islam movements that sprung out in the second half of the 20th century perhaps present only a temporary solution to current economic and environmental issues because, again, Islamizing disciplines presumes that Islam offers a quick fix to something that it's structurally wrong in Muslim majority countries, right? In other words, economic and environmental issues cannot be divorced from one another because they're epistemically connected, they're interrelated. And because economic and environmental questions were in the pre-modern period theorized or conceptualized within a metaphysical framework, it was often based on ethical, psychological, metaphysical premise. I think they have to be treated as such as well. Now, this finally then brings me to my last point, which is on the notion of decoloniality. The type of environmental problems that contemporary Muslim societies are facing are largely the result of industrialization and colonial modernity, meaning they are recent developments. Modernity and coloniality, obviously, there are concepts first used by Annibale Quijano and later developed by Walter Mignolo as well. It refers to the way in which these concepts, modernity and coloniality, are inseparable, two sides of the same coin, if you will. Like many post-colonialists, also decolonialists seek to draw attention to the relation between colonialism and the narrative of modernity, through which much of the world's history has come to be understood. Modernity then is viewed as an epistemological frame that is inseparably bound to the European colonial project. Mignolo states that modernity's history is linear and singular in that it pursues a single line of narrative. And since there is no modernity without coloniality, the radical shift first occurred in the economy that allowed Western empires to take over the resources that were associated with colonialism. The second transformation, and this is epistemological transformation, relates to the production of knowledge, right? To the sciences associated with scientific revolution. And Mignolo warns, however, that hidden in this transformation is a particular disregard for human life. He says, quote, hidden behind the rhetoric of modernity, economic practices dispense with human lives and knowledge justified racism and the inferiority of human lives that were naturally considered dispensable. So what is he then proposing? Something called epistemic delinking, right? A necessary operation that opens up space for vastly different, and I might add, not less scientific, discourses, analysis, perspectives on knowledge production about these fields, about economics, about environment, about nature. The process of decolonial epistemology brings to the surface other non-Western principles of knowledge production and also entails redefinition of the very terms that we're using on a daily basis, namely what exactly is economy, what is finance, what is environment, what is even nature itself. The question, of course, remains how exactly can teachings from the Islamic intellectual history contribute to these modern debates on environmental crisis on one hand, ecological exhaustion on the other hand, in light of the established economic systems on one hand, but also academic programs on the other hand. Why? Because as you know, the modern worldview has a rather narrow definition of what constitutes a scientific inquiry and hence also valid inquiry, right? Or reasoning, if you will, in economics and environment, which is based on this that can be measured. In other words, it's based on observables. And I think that religious literacy, I do not mean theology necessarily, but religious literacy, so examples from the intellectual tradition, from ethics, from Islamic historical tradition as well, is very, very important in this debate and in this context. In order to leave some time for your questions and comments, I would like to end on this note and thank you all for attending and for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. So we have seen a very complex discussion of various subject area that includes economics and ecology, and you have the scientific perception. And what I like to point out this to take the opportunity to show that how multidisciplinary research is extremely essential in our time. And what we have here is a researcher who's doing research on economics rather than being within the field. So we are so used to having scholars talk about a subject matter being the person inside the field. I'm not saying that you are not an economist, but we have this opportunity to actually have a bird's eye view of beginning from the earlier time of Islam. As you had mentioned earlier, I'd like to add actually that the early Islamic history from the 700 the time of the prophets and companions, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you can recall the surah Quraysh in the Quran, لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ إِيلَافِهِمْ رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ فَلْيَعْبُدُوا رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ الَّذِي أَطْعَمَهُم مِّن جُوعٍ وَآمَنَهُم مِّنْ خَوْفٍ. Right there you have the mention of winter and summer. And this is actually the traders of Arabia, how ecology is something that they weave into their trade and their business. So, you know, I was considering, you know, what you meant, and it came to mind that it's very organic. And we are brought by Dr. Sami towards the colonial time as he follows history, and the colonial project very much think about ecology is something that is to be mastered, which I have a question for you about MENA, or Middle East and North Africa, how you mentioned that the fact that it's a desert, there was a citation, a quotation, how because it's a desert, then it gives a kind of demands or for the Western perception that it has to be conquered. Well, I don't quite get that. Like, could you elaborate before I open up more to the floor? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, first, to on your note, I'm happy not to be, or I do not have a problem not being called an economist, since I'm trained in Islamic intellectual history. So this is completely fine. Now, to your point about MENA region being regarded as not a quote unquote proper, if you will, nature or natural habitat. This is how the colonial nations and forces used to quote unquote colonize the Middle East under the pretext that it's a desolate area. It needs to be revived, right? In how it needs to be revived? Well, through particular techniques and methods and also epistemologies. So this is how I see that the very notion of coloniality is obviously linked to colonialism. These are two connected yet distinct processes. The same goes for decolonization and decoloniality. Decolonization would mean, you know, breaking apart from the political, ideological, legal colonizations, whereas decoloniality means it's a much broader term. It's a much broader context that also includes knowledge production, the history of knowledge production about these particular colonial systems of frameworks of thought, right? So we are already living in decolonial times, but the forms, the systems, the structures of coloniality are still present. So decoloniality is here, I think, a necessary step that would mean not only a formal decolonization processes on legal, political means, militarily means, but also when it comes to the production of knowledge. Why I'm trying to emphasize this so much? Think of the concept of economics and how the whole field or discipline of Islamic economics emerges in second half of the 20th century, right? As a quote unquote a third way economic system, which in some cases and in some contexts, we can say that it was, perhaps, in the sense that it was criticizing capitalism on one hand, but also socialism on the other hand, right? However, for many scholars that are coming from that tradition, from Islamic economic tradition, they're still operating and using the same terms and methods, including the very notion of economics and finance, right? So in this sense, I'm rather critical when I read these contributions. Are they really breaking apart from what has been established before? Are they really operating with you know, different concepts altogether from what has been used for centuries prior to them, right? So this is what I see the formal process of decolonization. We might have achieved that, right? That we're living in post-colonial world, so to speak. But the structural processes of coloniality are still very much present, I think, throughout not only Islamic economics, but also other fields, when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to history of thought, history of sciences, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a long way for us to do exactly the opposite. And what this opposite means is, well, one, reassessing and admitting that the colonial structures are here. Second, analyzing and implementing what exactly lies underneath the indigenous traditions and knowledge production. What exactly can we learn from other non-European, non-Western traditions? How can we align that with our modern systems of thought and sciences as well? And can we really integrate some of these terms and concepts back into our discussion when, in our case, obviously, on the environment and nature.
Yes, there's a question, yeah.
Question and comment. Thank you very much for this very exhaustive analysis of crisis, environmental crisis and economic crisis, and then how we can get solutions from our medieval scholars like Mawardi, like Ghazali, and other great scholars. But now, as you said rightly, we are in search of quick fix solutions. I feel that as our scholar, you have mentioned some books, very important books, which have been written by our great scholars, medieval scholars. They were serious about the job. But in our times, people have not done that much of work to provide alternative systems of economics or environmental science. So my worry is that when we say that Islam is talking about protection of environment, there are, for example, Hindus, there are Buddhists. They think that environment is like God for them, and they have a lot of respect for that. But Muslims think as you say, so it means that Islam is for domination. It's helping that concept of dominating nature rather than becoming friendly to it. And this is a question. Second point is that medieval times and modern times, there is a lot of difference because of their metaphysics, not epistemology. We are highlighting always epistemology, but we are ignoring metaphysics. There was a metaphysical set of beliefs behind all those theories, which have been propounded by our medieval scholars like Ghazali. But now we talk only in the terms of epistemology, and we are just, in a sense, separating metaphysics and epistemology, and worldview is also affected by that. So modern world has been created by such a worldview where there is no scope for metaphysics, elimination of metaphysics. This was logical positivist, other philosophers have said that, even Russell and others. So in this mosaic situation, how we can just compare or how we can combine these diverse perspectives and then say that Islam has a solution for these all problems. And we are rooting ourselves in modern concept of environment, economic development, whatever. And then we say Islam has a solution for that. While as the ideologies and metaphysics of both systems are totally at divergence. So how we can reconcile with these two?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comment. And the question, I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I think that the frameworks of epistemology and metaphysics, they have to go hand in hand. It's impossible to disassociate them, at least when it comes to the classical period, right? Pre-coloniality, so to speak. You can see that clearly in the works, for instance, Mawardi, Al-Ghazali, Al-Isfahani, and Ibn Khaldun and other scholars as well. You can see that the issues of what we today call economic or environmental or financial thought, and I said thought because it's not necessarily a theoretical system yet, but it's spread out ideas that are rooted, nonetheless, they're rooted in Sharia's epistemology, right? And they weave through different disciplines. There was no such thing as an economic science back in the 7th, 8th, 10th, 11th century. Modern economic science, obviously, again, has very much to do with the division of modern sciences in early modern Europe, right? How we treat something as a social science versus natural science. And then humanities branches off even from social sciences, right? Because it doesn't deal with numbers and so on and so forth. So again, Is it observable? Can something be observable or not? It's something based on the physical or metaphysical truths as well, right? So works that try to rethink the indigenous forms of knowledge, I think, challenge such perspectives. So in my view, this would be a warm welcome addition to critiquing modern epistemology, because it lacks the notion of metaphysics, right? As a based on this accountability perception, right? What to do, and Seiko Senasar might be one scholar in the modern or in the contemporary period that deals with that, right? And he clearly says that the human being is part and parcel of the environmental system. The environmental system is part of a larger metaphysical system, and so on and so forth. So the things are very much connected in essence, right? Whatever you do, whatever harm you do to yourself, you're inadvertently and indirectly doing possibly harm to the environment as such, right? What to do about it or how to approach it, and I'm sort of getting different reiteration of this question, throughout all the time. Some would say this is museum studies. Who is reading Al-Mawardi today or Al-Ghazali? It's futile. It's useless, right? And you can argue for it. It's possible, but I would say that philosophy, broadly conceived, is probably more important today than in any other period in history, right? Ethical reasoning is more important today than in any other period. Why? Because we're battling against this system of neoliberal capitalism as well. So in the backdrop of environmental, ecological, financial crisis is capitalism, neoliberal system, right? What to do with it? Well, if we still appreciate scholars such as Aristotle today, 2000 plus years ago, right? I think we can integrate and incorporate scholars such as Al-Ghazali in our curricula, or Al-Mawardi, or Al-Isfahani. It just means that we have to go back to our sort of tradition, if you will, and read it from a broad perspective, not as you said that, quote unquote, Islam offers a quick fix. It has to do with Islam, but also it doesn't have to do with Islam directly. These problems are problems of humanity, right? Ecological exhaustion is something that we all face as human beings. So in this sense, I see it as contribution to humanity. Going back to scholars such as Al-Ghazali, Al-Mawardi, others, whether to read it preferably in Arabic or in a good translation, incorporating that in school curricula, in higher education systems. And this is where I sort of challenge also, the field of economics as well. And again, I'm not a specialist in the field, but I think, as you might know, and as I pointed out, economics has been conceptualized as being part of moral philosophy. Adam Smith was a trained moral philosopher, right? The background of economics is in moral philosophy. It has been, again, quote unquote, presented or hijacked by the Chicago School and other economists and saying Adam Smith is the father of modern economics. I mean, Adam Smith was very much concerned with ethical and moral questions as well, right? Yes, against governmental interference, but this does not make him a capitalist, right? So going back to these ethical, metaphysical, philosophical foundations of the sciences, the problems we're dealing with today, I think it's a good start. It's definitely not the end, but it's a good start.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I just finished a paper on ecological crisis as humanitarian crisis. I was very happy to see a reference to Anna Gadet's book, which is excellent on Muslim environmentalisms and very related to Southeast Asia. But my question is contemporary to Middle East. You know about the Doha Conference, 2012. I call it the marathon of conferences, the 2012 Doha Conference on desertification, where they reproclaimed that the Kyoto Protocol, which was of 1997, which was rejected, they reaffirmed. But immediately, America rejected the Doha Conference Protocol, saying that, no, they're going to go with the emissions and all that. Now, that is one issue. This conference takes place in Qatar, in Doha, and you mentioned about the Green Mosque. But my question is larger than that. That, okay, there are green mosques, but what about the rise of these mega cities in Mecca, in the Doha in all of the Middle East. And here, how will you address this question? Not ethically, but from the issue of environmental crisis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate your comment as well. You're right as well. I mean, I wasn't aware of the Doha conference that they sort of got rid of these previous policies and structures, but the approach that I have to these environmental processes that have been taking place throughout the greater, let's call it the greater Middle East. So from the 2010 onwards, right? The Green Mosque Initiative in Morocco, the Eco Mosque in Qatar, the power plant projects in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and so on and so forth. One, what is the end goal of these projects? How connected are they to the political manifestation and establishments or not? If they are, which certainly they are, in what way are they connected to the ongoing global economic project? Are they really challenging it or not? What are their Islamic sources, if any? And I mean it in a broad sense, either classical or contemporary, and so on and so forth. And the more questions you pose, the less clear answers actually you have to these types of processes. And that's why I'm applying a critical lens through this notion of environmental sustainability or environmental Orientalism, in the sense that what Thomas Valero says, we are readopting, and I'm paraphrasing, but we're readopting some of these colonial frameworks of existence, either within economic terms or even environmental terms. What exactly does environmental sustainability mean in the context of the greater Middle East, right? Is it adopting certain mechanisms and tools that indeed can be beneficial in the short to medium run? But what about the long run, right? And again, how much connected are they to the prevalent global economic systems, which I think they're inevitably connected to them. In the same vein, I'm critical of modern economic project, right? As important as it is to have this critical voice of something that it's new, something that goes beyond capitalism and beyond socialism, that it's rooted in Tawhidic epistemology, it nevertheless did not challenge the global economic system. It was integrated into it, or rather operates as a niche within it, right? So I affirm the importance of these tools and mechanisms, from zakat to riba to sadaqah to and beyond. But we cannot really talk about a system as such, an economic system that would be in place that can stand on its own feet, so to speak. This I can't see it anywhere in the Middle East or the Muslim world. Maybe we're still sort of in the process of creating it. So I wholeheartedly agree, and my work is in part dealing more and more with the environmental questions, because I see that if I want to truly understand and critically analyze the economic, I have to touch upon and delve into the environmental. The two are inseparably connected. So I hope that I will have maybe an even better answer in a few months' time.
Thank you. You've given a very enlightening and significant discourse for us to think about. Problem here is that we are not engaged with the base and superstructure of the global system. Even we talk about economics, we can produce knowledge, we can develop economics department. But again, our economic department is a clone of any other economic department in the world, in an Islamic university or in Islamic universities. So we are only reinforcing the problems that we are talking about. And I think here I've got some random thoughts and perhaps one question. The knowledge of economics is part of the development of the knowledge on society, 1600s, in intellectual history. And these become the knowledge in the social sciences. So social science knowledge and knowledge of sociology is developed to solve the problems of modern men. They are made to solve the problem of modernity and modern societies. And we have not resolved and dismantled ourselves, perhaps, as a group of people in this modern world who claim to be apart from the modern European West. And at the same time, we utter the mantra of sustainability. I get suspicious of the word sustainability. I do not use the word sustainability. In fact, I think we should expunge the word sustainability from our sociological category. So sustainability is a word that was developed when they were, the West felt that there was a threshold that it cannot control anymore. The beginnings of the new international economic order, I think, in Toronto, and that's how the word sustainability came about. And therefore, after that, the Muslims echo sustainability everywhere, including to create a SDG, I don't remember what, 16 or 17. But to me, this is part of the system that we are against. So again, when we talk about sustainability, we are cloning the word sustainability as produced by the West. So we are not producing anything. And this is where I think it's important for us to, one of the things that we can do is to read the classics, but also to read the modern classics. We have to reread Adam Smith, Max Weber, Pareto, Schumpeter, and so on. Because they were writing, these two, especially Adam Smith and Max Weber, they were writing as priests. They were not writing as economists. So this is where I think we have to read these works in a different lens. The other one is, we see that, you express in the domain of what we call inter and transdisciplinary. But actually, we have to move into a post-disciplinary condition. No more transdisciplinary, no more interdisciplinary. Post-disciplinary is where we produce new science and new knowledge. Move out of the episteme of economics, for example. I mean, when you talk about social science, you talk about the Chicago School, fantastic. There are borders, there are territories, sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, psychology. These are 5 classic social sciences. These do not descend from heaven. There was a moment in history in which they were born, and there'll be a moment in the future that they will decay and die out. So this is the moment, and when we talk about Islamization, de-Westernization, alternative knowledge systems as such, Tawhidic, this is a moment where we need to look into a post-disciplinary conditions where territorial boundaries, assumptions, methodologies should not be taken to be obedient to what we want to do. We should not be faithful to these methodologies anymore, and we should create, or rather we should create new methodologies to solve themes which are post-discipline. And this is important for this university and other Muslim societies. So this brings me to one question, maybe related or not related. There's been a movement, I don't know for how long, but in some recent years, the degrowth movement, which I think began in France, and it's debated much in Scandinavian countries. How would that be significant to our movement? To what we're doing now, because I think the degrowth movement is a response to what happened when we talk about 60s, is perhaps another way of looking at E.F. Schumacher's Buddhist economics, small is beautiful, perhaps. So again, it is not a permanent solution, but it is a momentary way of looking back, taking one step back, and perhaps momentarily devolving ourselves. Like when we go to Mecca, we tawaf, it's anti-clockwise. So so again, the performance of the Hajj, it's devolution. So the idea of devolution perhaps have to come to the picture in terms of our initiative at looking at a different economic system. Again, it is at the level of epistemology, not at the level of operationalization, or not at the level of involving ourselves in the structure of economics. And I'm looking into the curriculum in the economics schools and departments. Again, we need to transform, or not transform, I don't like, but reform and revamp the social sciences as such in order to move forward in terms of our contribution to the modern world.
Thank you for this comments, Professor. To your first point, I think you're right that it has, when we talk about both classics but also modern scholars, it's about revisiting them and reclaiming them, right? So Adam Smith, I think, has been somewhat falsely presented as the father of modern economy, right? If we start from that point onward, so reclaiming, rethinking them as philosophers, as moral philosophers, or even as ethicists, right? First and foremost, I read Al-Ghazali as an ethicist because he's really delving through so many various fields that he's a philosopher, he's a Sufi, he's all of the above. But if you look at these scholars as ethicists, I think we might be onto something here, right? Why? Because we have a shared concern when it comes to producing new epistemologies, new sources of knowledge as well. So absolutely reclaiming or reviving the classics. In the same breath, I think we have to be cautious not to delve into so-called reverse Orientalism by trying to indigenize some of the sciences and some of the scholarships and some of the epistemologies that we have. So it's not about discarding the modern knowledge and just sort of looking back into our own tradition, but trying to sensibly make sense. Where do they converge if they do? What is the benefit of our modern division of knowledge, if any? How can we add other types of knowledge production onto it, and so on and so forth, right? Perhaps it can be done, as I said, when it comes to sustainability, absolutely has to be criticized and critically thought. But maybe the alternative is accountability. I try to think of that as like human accountability, wholesome, full-fledged accountability of the self, either through tazkiyah or other concepts that might be helpful for our sort of theoretical project. When to your question about the degrowth movement, I would say yes. I mean, it can be helpful. Is it a permanent solution? I doubt. But it's a one mosaic. Yeah. Even beyond, yes, it's a problem. Sort of the Western frameworks, right? So it can be a mosaic. But for me, the important question in this context would be, if you have the growth movement, if you have Schumacher, small is beautiful, if you have like all of these sort of instances and movements and schools of thought and individuals as well in texts, are we really dismantling the system, right? So in a traditional Marxist way, capitalism can fall only with a revolution, right? So you can replace a political system or economic system once you're fully done with it. If you're still maintaining it and simply using certain terms and tools and mechanisms, while the system is actually healthier and stronger than ever before, then it's not being challenged enough. So the end question or the end goal here would be great for all these movements, but are we still dealing with the same system in place? And the answer might be, well, yes. However, I do not want to dismantle or dismiss the importance of these small mosaics that have been springing up throughout the world, really. I mean, both in the West, but also in other parts of the world.
Yeah, but Muslim societies have been quite slow.
True, yes, and I think, and this is obviously a multifaceted problem. Partially, it has to do definitely with colonialism and the effects of colonialism on the Muslim majority countries. Parts of it has to do with the knowledge production that the Muslim majority world adopted and integrated and made it indigenous of sorts, erroneously so. And part of it has to do with the socioeconomic conditions of the Muslim world as well, right? So, at the end of the day, if you think of the Abbasid period, why it was so successful, well, it's obviously because of the economy. Once you have a healthy vibrant economy, you will have vibrant sciences and vibrant arts and literature and translation movements and so on and so forth. So economy is extremely important. If you have a healthy economy, you will have a healthy society, but it depends in which direction it goes.
The Deputy Dean, and then we'll open up for the people online, inshallah.
All right. Just Fatima, it's okay. The question is not coming from the Deputy Dean. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami and the professors for their comments. I really enjoyed the session and I'm enjoying it so far. I noticed that during your presentation, you didn't talk about capitalism, but as you were responding to our questions, because as you were talking about economy and environment and sustainability, I think the elephant in the room for me was capitalism. But it wasn't mentioned in the presentation, and I wondered if you did that intentionally, and perhaps if so, maybe just a curiosity from me, why is that? Because I think as we're stitching up the conversation today, it's very systemic as we're thinking about a healthy, vibrant economy, the education system, whether to change, reform or revamp the education system is still part and parcel of capitalism and the tool of capitalism, and sustainability also as a tool to sustain capitalism, right? A response and a tool to sustain capitalism. So, and even so, as movements come along, if it is a very systemic problem, like you said, the movements will not go very far. And as Marx would say, it would require a revolution, right? And I also wondered, in your presentation just now, you mentioned that, but throughout the conversation later, you did address slightly or briefly, the Islamization has been seen as quick fixes. But also Prof. Hamid mentioned just now in terms of how we're thinking about epistemology and metaphysics. And I don't think those would be quick fixes, but since it's a systemic problem, beyond the epistemology and the metaphysics, it's also thinking about practical things because we're dealing with people and what they're going through, and that's everyday life that requires immediate implementation, as Prof mentioned, not just to think about the epistemology, but when we think about the society and people, it's more everyday life, and they may be part of the system, but they cannot resist the system because there are no other options available when we're thinking about society. So that would be my second thing to address. Finally, I just wondered if you had considered, because I did not see in your presentation, is movements on permaculture. And I think some of the works on permaculture today, and there are a few in Malaysia that are trying to move with a clearer epistemology of Islamization, and also in terms of practical implementation as well, as a form of maybe degrowth as well, degrowth kind of movement. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this. Indeed, I've mentioned capitalism in the Q&A, not in my presentation. However, I do discuss it in my works, both in the two recent books, but also in the articles. So capitalism is the driving force of many of these problems that we're facing, either financial or when it comes to ecological exhaustion and even climate change at the end of that, right? And again, capitalism goes hand in hand with colonial modernity, right? For Halak, if there is no modernity, there is no capitalism. The two are going hand in hand, right? How do you embellish the system? And this is, I think, part of the problem. So we're embellishing the system through the notion of green economy, through the notion and discourses and analysis and programs of business ethics. So we're making the system slightly more embellished, slightly more beautiful, maybe slightly less evil. However, we're still dealing with the same system at the end of the day. And I fear that in some context, the Islamic economic, let's call it economic and financial system, is part of this discourse. Perhaps inadvertently, perhaps unintentionally. So it hasn't, to my mind, it has not reached the solution as perhaps it had in the 70s or in the 80s, as something that is completely new, novel, structural, that really goes beyond the current issues and so on and so forth. I don't think we've reached that level yet, right? To the second point on Islamization of knowledge, but also that it has to go beyond the epistemology, I agree. And, some of the classical scholars, I think they address that, to be honest. Mawardi, Al-Shaybani, Al-Ghazali, they discuss the basic provisions, right? They would agree that what human needs is you need food, you need shelter, you need clothes. These are the basic provisions. You can have more if you want. So making profit is allowed, even traditionally speaking, even religiously speaking. To make profit is allowed. The problem is not with gaining money or wealth. The problem is with, one, what is the intention? Two, what do you do with it? How do you spend it? Does it circulate back into economy or in society or not? So basic provisions are a must. Food, shelter, clothing, right? And I mean, as we know, there's homelessness in our society. There is systemic poverty in our societies as well, meaning these are not addressed, right? So the quote unquote, the epistemological, those issues that relate to the notion of ilm are very much connected to amal. They should be connected to praxis. So for someone like Al-Ghazali, there should be no distinction between the two. And I think we should maybe, take benefit from that, right? Again, it starts with knowledge. Perhaps it starts with knowledge, but it shouldn't end there, right? The end goal is to make a society a better place, right? It has to have practical implications.
Okay, we have a question. You'd like to
To
continue?
your third point, I haven't looked into the permaculture, and Malaysia perhaps something to take notice of. Thank you.
We have a question from our listener, viewer online, Dr. Mohammed. Oh, Dr. Mohammed, sorry. Please forgive me for that.
Yes. Sami Hocam, thank you very much. You mentioned the classical works. So I wish to remind the Maghazi tradition or Maghazi books, because I guess this is very important to understand Islamic economics, where it started or not started. I connected this early 1st, 2nd century Maghazi works and connected to Ottoman story. So some Ottoman historians, Turkish ones, claim that Ottomans did not want to be capitalists. So they did not prefer to be capitalists intentionally. I don't believe it. So you mentioned that 11th and 12th century classics scholars mentioned some critical view of, you didn't mention dynasties, but I say dynasties, because this is the turbulences appeared and continued since 11th and 12th century. They were timely to criticize, but these critics did not go on. Even during the time of Ottomans, late 16th century, all the 7th and 18th century, forget the 19th century, because everything finished. Lahiyas means that the semi-official, official reports to the state criticizing purely economic policies of the Ottoman state, purely economic activities of the sultans and the pashas, not the moderate, mainstream, or grassroots traders. So that is something a greater miss in the link between this Maghazi and the Ottomans. So sister gave an example from Quraysh, the ayah, summertime, but it didn't give us any details. It is our interpretation now. The Maghazi created a sort of economic fundamentals for the coming dynasties. So my question is that, reading this 11th, 12th centuries, or partially maybe Ottoman Lahiyas, can we understand today, contemporary world, what has been happening in economics? Because we missed some more centuries. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler hocam. Thank you. Thank you. So I haven't looked into the Maghazi literature. I think it's very important. It's absolutely important. the approach that I had, at least for the last,
Sentence, actually, because Ottoman state theoretized intentional or unintentional this Magazi fundamentals.
Yeah.
They theorized and they consistently followed up until it collapsed down.
Yeah. So it would be, I mean, I think it would be very relevant for the types of projects that I'm looking into as well. The text that I picked for my recent work, or the scholars that I'm looking into, on one hand, we can say these are prominent figures in Islamic history. If you think of Shaybani, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, al-Isfahani, Ghazali, but also Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khalid al-Jawziyya, Ibn Khaldun. This is sort of the range from the 7th to the roughly 14th, 15th century. Right? You can claim that these are an ideal set of theories coming from some of the most respected figures in Islamic history. To what extent they really relate to the issues on the ground. If it's an ideal set of theories, ethical theories, to what extent have they been followed, and so on and so forth. I think this is a legitimate claim, right? Al-Ghazali, as we know, for instance, he's clear that Ihya is not necessarily for the Amma. It's for the elite as well, right? It's not for the regular folk. So I think we have to be cognizant of these critiques as well. But nevertheless, why am I looking into that? Well, first, I was interested in their, if you will, ethical Sufi perspectives on economic thought, and this is broadly conceived, right? Second, because they navigate various domains of knowledge. That's why it was very interesting to me as well. Third, there is an implicit critique of the governmental officials, at least for some scholars. And I think this brings into question, what do we mean when we say zuhd, right? What do we mean when we say even tasawwuf and Sufism? We often have this idea of Sufism or Sufis being those who are detached from the world. They have nothing to do with society. I think this is it's an erroneous perception, right? Al-Ghazali points out that actually, no, as a wandering Sufi, you have to come back to the society. That kasb is as important as zuhd. So acquisition of wealth, being part of the society, being part of socioeconomic problems, is actually incumbent upon you as a faith-based tradition, right? So zuhd and kasb go hand in hand. But I agree that this might be an ideal set of theories or scholars that I was dealing with. That in other words, that there is much more to that history to be discovered, and especially in the Ottoman period as well. There is one scholar that deals with the economic thought in the Ottoman tradition, who is based in Oriental Institute in Beirut, Fatih Ermish, I believe. So he's someone I've been in contact with, but I know that he works specifically on the Ottoman tradition as well. And I think it would be very beneficial to look into it more from other perspectives when it comes to socio-political questions, and not necessarily these, high-level ethical, philosophical, or even metaphysical ideas. So thank you for that. Yes,
Yes, and go ahead.
This might be a very a very prominent question, or it might be it might be a scary one. Let's give her the floor. Maybe in the future, let's see what happens.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, of Iranian studies. I've always wondered, whenever I attend these lectures of yours, it's always a discussion of the kind of the first word that comes to mind is bemoaning, but it's not bemoaning, but a particular sadness about the reification or mimicry of a particular kind of philosophical thought, and having it been sort of supplanted or mimicry by Muslim communities. And I've always been surprised why your rejoinder has not been a kind of reflection of Edward Said's work. In 1982, 83, he produced the work, The World, the Text, and the Critic, right? It's a wonderful compilation. And there's one particular essay there called Traveling Theory, which I've said it can be a kind of rejoinder for you when you meet this particular kind of critique that the mimicry has taken place. So what does he say? He says that he's looking at the Hungarian philosopher Lukács from the 1920s, and he's saying that the particular theories that Lukács is referring to, heralding from Marx's theories, he focuses on reification, right? That people, in the end of it all, become things, thingification. And Said says that any kind of theory, if you look at its origin, when it is sort of found in other places, because this particular theory of reification is used by other philosophers 30 years, 40, 50 years later, in some ways it becomes diluted of sorts, right? He says this, but it's peripatetic in nature and it takes on the kinds of features of the new context. So for instance, in the discussion of sustainability, the sustainability of perhaps the Americans or the Europeans, when taken on by Muslim communities, takes on something else, some new form, some new power. And in 1994, from 1982 to 1994, Said pretty much stuck to this idea of the peripatetic natures of theories, that they just travel. That's just the mosaic is ipso facto part of epistemological production, right? Theory, knowledge production. But in 1994, he says, this is a caveat, an essential caveat, that yes, these original theories, they lose their particular kind of power and force, but it's also a moment for communities to reinvigorate a new kind of power, a new kind of dynamism. And so he uses the example of Lukács and Fanon, right? And he says that Lukács and Fanon are actually speaking about the same kinds of subjects, yet we should put them in conversation with each other. What can be produced, right? So I'm always like, whenever I hear these things to you, I'm like, just say it. Go back to Said and say that, and talk about the particular power that is capable, that the Muslims are able to produce this particular power and force, and chart, look throughout philosophy, building from each other, right? But also creating something even more dynamic and multidisciplinary and so on and so forth.
Yeah, sorry, he says you mentioned Said's traveling theory. Yeah, his theory has been ignored by many of us. He's one of the examples that he gave was the university.
Yeah.
The function of the university. It's not a fixed kind of moment in history. So again, our universities, you have to think about it.
I just want to add something. What you said also happens in interreligious dialogue. They set the agenda and they ask us to respond to their questions. And that's also a catch-22 situation. And we repeat saying Islam says this. Basically, we are apologizing on those issues. Thank you.
One point I just want to, if I am allowed, I think that basically, for example, we may take Ghazali. How Ghazali set his theories in force. He was first well versed with his environment and the thought which was prevalent, Greek thought. He wrote a book, Maqasid al-Philosopher. And then he explained what are the views and doctrines of the philosophers of his times, and they were pertaining to all subjects, economics included. But in modern times, our scholars, they are not very well versed with the modern theories, and they have not mastered those. And just as you said rightly, a quick fix, we are after that, and we just want to reply without understanding. We have to first understand modern economic theories and other things in their different perspectives, epistemological, metaphysical, although there's no metaphysics, epistemology at the most. And sometimes worse than that. If we go to Bertrand Russell and others, it is sensory knowledge, sense data, and nothing else. Even there is no logic in that way, sensibilia. So I feel that our scholars of economics, they are just trying to, as Professor Imtiaz has rightly said, what our agenda is being set for us, and we are just echoing that. And this has been mentioned by Sartre also in The Wretched of the Earth, in the foreword of that, as Madam has mentioned about Fanon. So I feel that, problem with us, we are not well versed with all the present theories about economics, and we are not coming with Islamic rebuttal of that. And we just want to graft these here and there, and without just demolishing this thought first, so that we may create room for our thought. People may take our thought seriously. And unless and until Ghazali wrote Maqaz al-Philosopher, then he wrote Tahaf al-Philosopher, then he wrote Ihya-ul-Ulumuddin. We are writing Ihya-ul-Ulumuddin for the first instance, and there's a problem without understanding, contextualizing. And second point is that modern world has been created, theories have been created by philosophy and science, and we are replying it with theology. That's the problem. We have to understand that world at their level, and after criticizing their level, then we have to come to religious aspects. Otherwise, the world is not ready to listen what we say, because they don't believe in these things at all. They have left God knows long before behind them when they espouse the theories of secularism or humanism or capitalism, and capitalism especially. And more Muslims have criticized humanism more than capitalism. Maybe Maududi and others also. But they have not criticized capitalism. And they became part and parcel of the agenda and making it sustainable in many ways, as you said rightly. So we are also propounding and espousing their agenda sometimes. And then we are just presenting quick fix solutions. And even this scheme of interest-free banking, that has not also taken any roots in our society to that extent, as it is being claimed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. SAMI, can I ask a
Yes.
question? It's part of all the discussion questions so far. So our last question from Dr. Hazira online is, how do we reclaim and position our concept of sustainability compared to UN SDGs as a part of the ways to decolonize from colonity? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in part, this was addressed at least in some context, but maybe to connect some of these dots together, it's to presenting different types of theories and concepts as well, right? It's not to say, but ours is less scientific because they're rooted in an ethical worldview or a metaphysical worldview. They can be as valid and as powerful as well, right? Even though they come from other traditional intellectual traditions, right? The Muslim world has always borrowed from other cultures and from other notions and nations as well. And this goes back to your point, Soraya, as well with Edward Said. I mean, Edward Said you cannot bypass Edward Said either through Orientalism or other works in some capacity, in some form. Even scholars such as Halak, they would heavily criticize Said as well on many regards, right? But Muslim culture has always borrowed from other traditions as well. 7th century onwards, from other monotheistic traditions, from philosophical traditions, from Persian world, from Indian world. But the difference is that unlike today, it was borrowing from a position of strength, from a position of socioeconomic strength, right? Post-colonialism, it has been borrowing not from a position of strength, from a subordinated position. No, exactly. It's not borrowing to sort of keeping. Borrowing, and in legal terms, you might see legal borrowings from other legal traditions. In philosophical terms, you might see philosophical borrowings and so on and so forth. Is merging and also creating something new. I mean, about, in the whole of Islamic philosophical tradition, how heavily, at least when it comes to Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, how heavily is based on the ancient Greek tradition, right, of Aristotle and Plato. But also in the same breath, the Muslim tradition developed something called hikmah as a self-standing epistemological philosophical system. So it's beyond quote unquote borrowing, taking. It's creating something new. And I think we have to give credit where credit is due. And I think we're still dealing with this sort of colonial understanding of Islamic history as being only the transmitters, only the translators, and nothing else, right? So indeed, to your point, I agree, right? I agree. But I think we can even go beyond Said. I mean, Said is maybe in this context reverberating something that has been said in other capacities as well, right? If you look at the pre-modern classical tradition, borrowings, but as an active mode of conduct, has always been part and parcel of the Islamic tradition as well, even up till now to modernity, right?
Okay. That's the end of our discussion today, but let me just sum up how we have gone through the different discourses, and we have thrown different ideas and ruminate on the solution, whether it is possible to generate a problem or if that is not the time now. But I strongly believe our very pressing situation with the Gaza war and the Trump trade assault, or whatever you may call it, is something that push us to find a solution. Hopefully, this is the time that we have to make a decision. So without further ado, I thank our speaker and also pass the mic to our chairman.
Yeah,
Chairman of the meeting.
Thank you very much. Just conclude a little bit. So thank you, Dr. Sami, for the beautiful presentation and the vibrant discussion we have today. And his presentation actually reminded us that economy is not merely about markets, and the environment is not merely about climate. They are, in fact, reflections of who we are as moral beings. And Dr. Sami has taken us on a journey from classical texts to contemporary crisis to remind us that Islamic intellectual tradition did not separate economy from ethics, nor environment from the soul. And in that tradition, wealth is not an end, but a trust. Nature is not a resource, but a sign. And human beings are not owners, but caretakers. And in a world that often defines progress by accumulation and speed, his call for a cosmological understanding invites us to slow down and actually reflect, to remember that real sustainability begins not with technology or policy alone, but with the purification of the self, that is tazkiyah, and the renewal of our intentions, that is niyyah, and the reorientation of our actions toward the divine. And let me close with a timeless reminder from the Quran, وَلَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ بَعْدَ إِصْلَاحِهَا. Do not cause corruption upon the earth after it has been set in order. And this verse is just not about environment. It is about balance between dunya and akhirah, between self and society, and between material gain and spiritual integrity. And thank you, Dr. Sami, again for reminding us that the path forward may, in fact, lies in looking deeply and wisely into our past. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.